Hello and welcome to the Black Belt in Thinking webinar. So the purpose of this webinar is to introduce you to a practical tool you can use in your life to take away and actually improve things with. So with that in mind, we're going to have a very interesting speaker today. We've got my guest, Chandell, who will be talking to us about framing for outcomes. Now, given her experience with being a master trainer in NLP, coaching and hypnosis, and a master timeline therapy trainer, this is going to be a very interesting presentation. So I strongly recommend you get your pen and paper, or perhaps Evernote, or whatever you've got out ready to go. We will have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So get ready with some questions there. And for those, please pop them in the Q&A section of Zoom rather than the chat, if you can. It's just easier for us to work through them in an organized fashion at the end like that. But other than that, yeah, get your notes out and get ready to take them down for how to learn about framing for outcomes. So over to you, Chandell.
Thank you so much, and what a great pleasure it is to be here with you guys today. I'm going to, I've got a couple of slides here. I'm just wondering if I can be spotlighted on the screen here so that they come up, and yep, beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Really fantastic to be here. I want to thank all of you for jumping on. I think that learning is just such an important thing, and there's always different hacks and different things that we can do to make sure that we're being more efficient and more effective, and particularly when it comes to dealing with other people and making decisions and communicating with them, things can go awry. And so what I've got here for you today is a tool that I've developed called Framing for Outcomes, as Peter said, and I'm going to take you through this process, give you a couple of different contexts where you can use it and where you can utilize it, and explain to you what it is. So we'll crack on into the content, and I just want to acknowledge everybody for putting the time aside and being here today, investing in yourself. So as I said, this tool that I've developed is called Framing for Outcomes, which is getting traction with your communication, and also making better decisions, being more congruent in that when you're dealing with other people as well. And so I dislike it when people spend an entire seminar talking about themselves. I promise you I won't do that. But just for way of introduction, for those of you that haven't met me before, as stated, I am a master trainer of neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP as it's commonly known. And for those of you that may not be familiar with NLP, it's an art and science on how people make decisions, what makes them behave the way that they do, and how we can use the language of our mind to get better outcomes with ourselves and others. So I'm a published author. I wrote a book called Confident Closing. We grew a business by 400% in just 6 months using some of these tools, of which I'll introduce to you today. I do a lot of work in the sales strategy area, bringing together psychology and strategy in the sales process. And I've been in business, in corporates, dealing with enterprise across multiple different industries for more than 20 years. Before I was a trainer, I did a lot of work with sales teams and project teams, and so familiar with some of the challenges that can come up when there's multiple people involved in a project. And so one of the things that I'd love to do for you guys, and I'll get Peter to pop this into the chat for us so that way you can access it, I'd love to gift everybody a copy of my book, which is an audio book, Confident Closing, number of different things around interpreting behaviors from other people and how you can get better at it. So that's my gift to you guys. If you want to access that, then you can definitely grab that via that link there. So what I see as being the biggest challenge, why are we going to share this stuff with you? Well, often what can happen when we're trying to produce outcomes, when we're trying to make decisions, when we're trying to communicate with whether it be external stakeholders, or it be within teams, or even just with family and friends. Sometimes this is communication happens on all platforms, decision making happens on all platforms. There's often a lot of misunderstanding about outcomes. There's multiple different styles of communication, which I'll go through a little bit today as part of presenting this tool for you. But one of the biggest challenges is around the fact that there's a lot of assumption that goes on in our thinking, because things are normal and present to us. And so we just assume that other people get it in the same way that we do. And so you're going to look at this tool as a way of overcoming assumption, absolutely stamping out the miscommunication and the misunderstanding that happens in our communication, and sometimes even in our own thinking process. So this tool can be used to problem solve as well. And the other thing is that we don't often have any structure to our requests. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a second. But the real issue often we find, like those are the perceived issues or the challenges, but the real issue we often find is that there's a lack of conscious awareness in our communication. I'm not sure whether you guys are aware, but we actually are processing 11 million bits of information per second, and we're only capable of being able to choose and focus on 126 bits. Now, just conceptualize that for a moment. Imagine that I hand you like 11 million Mentos, right, in 1 second, and in 1 second you have to try and count out. If you don't know, we might have people logging on from all over the world. You know those little minties, those like mints that you find at conferences? It's they're Mentos. So, or Mentos. So, you know, imagine I'm throwing all of those at you like in a second, and in 1 second, that same second, you have to count out 126 of them. Like, it just wouldn't happen. So your brain is this amazing supercomputer that's processing all of this data, but the people next to you and the ones you're communicating with, they're also processing all of this data, and we're choosing different bits of information every single second. So we're going to bring in some conscious awareness to our communication. Sometimes people have a lack of boundaries in the way in which they communicate as well. So for example, you know, you might be very clear on your deadline and what needs to happen, what steps need to go forward, but we've not communicated that. And so, you know, someone gets a task and they think that, you know, it's easy for them to be able to put that off or do it next week, or they don't understand the urgency, or maybe they do it in a really big hurry and you only needed it like next month and they missed another deadline because you gave them something that they prioritized to the front of the queue. And the other thing is that there's often no clarity in our communication. So here's takeaway number one, guys. Takeaway number one is the meaning of the communication is the response that you get. So what do I actually mean by that? Well, I have a quick story to share with you that may help you to conceptualize this. And so it was many, many years ago. I was working in corporate, had a team of people that I was project leading, and a couple of them came to me and asked for a few things, right? There was a guy named Ken, there was a guy named Tony. So Tony comes in and he says, "Oh, Chandell, I need you to help me put together this project map, and we've got to get it to the client, and you know, if you can do that, that'd be really fantastic." And I said, "Yeah, not a problem." And then about a half an hour to an hour later, Ken came to me and he says, "Oh, Chandell, we've got this really important thing that we need to do. We've got to put this presentation and the scope of work together for this client. You know, can we do that?" And I said, "Yep, not a problem." And I put it in my my pile, you know, of the things in the queue of what I need, my work in progress. And half an hour later, Ken comes back and he says to me, "Hey, how are you going with that presentation and all of that stuff that we needed to do?" And I said, "Oh, look, I'm working on something for Tony. You know, he needs it ASAP, so I'm getting to it." And he goes, "But I've got to get out there in an hour." So I rang Tony and I said, "Hey, you know, Ken's come. He's got something really important. He's got a deadline. When do you need yours by? Because you said ASAP." And he goes, "Oh, for me, next week is fine." Right? So, you know, the communication that we use, the response that we get is indicative of how we communicate what we're actually asking for. Both those gentlemen asked me to complete this stuff ASAP. So I prioritized them in the order that they came to me, but that didn't necessarily mean that that was the deadline. So the meaning of the communication is the response you get. And many of us are not actually communicating. What generally happens is we get upset or we make value judgments against people. Who's ever been in that situation where you go and ask somebody for something and you're like, "How dense is that guy? He just didn't get it," right? Like, I mean, I was so clear in my communication. So what I created after working with a number of different teams across multiple different industries, I do a lot of work in the IT space, in the franchising space. I work with people in service businesses. I work with people across all different project organizations. And what I recognized was that a lot of people were, you know, technically brilliant. So this tends to be a thing that is even more so, even more of a problem when we have people that are technically brilliant. Like, they're so well versed in being able to design things and they're super technical. But then when it comes to the art of being able to communicate anything that's not technical and to set boundaries and frames around that, they need a structure to follow. And so that was my motivation to create this tool, and it's a pleasure to be able to share it with you today. So I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A for everybody as well. So if there's more to come through, then please feel free to pop your questions and things like that. I know Peter will be helping us out as well. So let's talk about what is framing for outcomes. So what we know about from our studies in NLP and neurolinguistic programming is we know that there are multiple different ways to communicate with people with different learning styles, with different filters, with different belief systems. And so what we've been able to do is draw together a number of those different criteria for different learning styles to encompass into this framing for outcomes tool. And as I said, this is something that you can use in multiple contexts. So you can use this tool with yourself simply to run through the options for a project, to get clear on what you want to communicate, to make decisions about what's going to be the best outcome. You can also utilize it in a phone conversation. So for those of you that sometimes when you get on the phone, you forget to mention certain things, you can do a little quick brainstorm and actually create this and then have the conversation based on your guided notes. You can utilize it in email communication, informal communication. You can put it in your different CRM programs and things like that, that you might be tracking activity or project plans, project management tool software, etc. So what it does is it actually reduces the confusion of what we're asking for and sets parameters for people to actually stand by. It allows for the multiple different learning styles that a lot of different people have, and it creates efficiency and effectiveness to produce outcomes. And so as we start to get into, what this is, I think it's really important to recognize that there are some people who actually will process their information. So you might like to take some notes on this part, because you may have some conscious awareness of this, but perhaps you don't bring it into your planning for your communication. So there are some people that will need to have an overview. So let's say that I was meeting with you one-on-one. One of the questions that I might ask you is, if we were going to do a project together, would you like to know kind of the vision and everything that we want to achieve, or would you need to know all of the particulars and the details, or would you need to know both? And so there would be some of you that would answer, no, I just need the big picture and then I can make an informed decision about whether it's something I'm interested in pursuing. Some of you would say, well, give me the vision first and then I'll need some details. I'll ask which ones I need. Some people need all of the details because they can't conceptualize the big picture. And then there are some people that need a little bit of both in whichever order, as I mentioned before. So that's one aspect. And a lot of the time we neglect to notice, like we'll use our own communication style to communicate with others. So if you noted which one was your preference, so whether you're a vision person, a big picture, or whether you're a details person, what you'll recognize is that generally that's the way that you communicate with others. And so for me personally, I need the big picture first. And if I don't have the big picture, I find it really hard to follow details for people. So much so, and I told you that this might work with, friends and family as well. In fact, I had a couple who saved their marriage using this tool. So stay tuned. If you're looking to improve the communication in your relationship as well, you can use it there too. So one of the things that I recognize in communication is that often, and it happens a lot in couples, we had a couple that utilized this, is that, he was very big picture. He just wanted kind of like the big picture. What do you want from me, darling? Give me the big picture, get to the point. Whereas she was all details and she wanted to tell him the whole story before she actually got to her request. And this used to frustrate him, and also it made her feel not mistreated, that's not the right word. It made her feel misunderstood, perhaps maybe not as important, that he didn't have the patience to listen to her story, that he didn't care what she needed, when in actual fact it was just a bit of a mismatch in communication style. Now, I know I used an example that's not necessarily a professional one. However, this stuff can happen in our teams too. Like you might be leading a project and you've got people on the team, you need to create an outcome, you ask for something, and that person's looking for clarification. You cut them off because it's not your communication style, and they move away feeling, unappreciated, or that, you're a tyrant to work for because you never listen to them, or, all sorts of terrible things can happen as a result of our communication going awry. So let's look at the tool. Let's let's take some notes on this, guys, and let's have a look at the tool. So our framing for outcomes method consists of 4 different quadrants, right? So I'll give you the overview and the big picture first for those of you that might be big picture, and then I'll chunk down on each of the particular areas. Now, what I want to encourage everybody to do is to actually take some notes on each of these segments, because I'm going to challenge you to do this task before the end of the day so that you can solidify your learning. So make sure that you're taking lots of notes. I'm a big fan, I didn't mention it in my introduction, but I'm a big fan of implementation. And so what you'll see is that I'll give you some examples and some stories along the way so that you can grab where you can use this. But it's no good if you just have a bunch of really great notes from this webinar today and then you never utilize the tool. So your results are going to come from actually implementing it. So I'm going to share those examples as we go through this process. So the very first part of the framing for outcomes that I mentioned before is that there are some people that are really big picture, and they need to know the intention, or they need to know the vision, or they need to know the understanding of, well, what are we doing this for? Why sometimes are we doing this? And so when we look at this framework, I know that sometimes people will actually have the context so clear in their mind. I mean, let's face it, if you've been working on a project for 6 months, you already have, solidified your vision for the project because you've been working on it for 6 months. So it's day in, it's second nature to you. So, we start with the big picture, which helps us to set context. And the best way to understand context is a little metaphor that I use. Imagine that, I'm going to offer you a cup of coffee. Now, I also know that if I just brought over a coffee pot and I just poured it in front of you on the table, you'd probably be pretty upset because that wasn't what I actually offered you. I offered you a cup of coffee. So I first have to give you the cup to then put the coffee into. And so a lot of us are pouring coffee all over the desks of our colleagues when we give them all of the details and the content of what we want without actually giving them a container to hold it in first. So I know it's a little bit of a corny metaphor, and not many of us are pouring coffee on our colleagues, obviously, but I think that it's really important to remember that sometimes there are people that absolutely need to have a container to put our requests and our knowledge into. The second part is about what specifically are we actually wanting from them? This is where we give our instructions. This is the content. This is those details, people. And then we've got a segment here that most of the time gets missed out of the communication, which is our next steps and our deadline. So the order and sequence, I'll unpack that a little bit more as we go through line by line. And then the final piece is our follow-up. And this is almost always missed out. And I'm going to talk to you about boundaries, consequences, and rewards, and that'll make more sense in terms of that follow-up process. So I'm keeping an eye on the chat there, and the Q&A as well. So I think we've already got a question in there. Maybe Peter can answer that as we come through the content at the Q&A at the end. We're doing Q&A at the end, right? So
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Beautiful, excellent. So thank you for the questions coming through. Keep them coming through, guys, and we'll come to them towards the end of the presentation. So let's have a look first at our very first box here, which is the intention and the big picture. This is our context. So as I said before, what we really want to be doing is giving people a container to be able to hold this in. And so we often will just go straight into our request, or we'll go straight into the details of the things that we need. My father is an illuminations engineer, and one of the things that I know about engineers and mathematicians and scientists is they tend to go explaining the details first before they set context. And so I've had many an argument with my father where I'll stop him and I'll say, Dad, why are you telling me this? Just stop, hold up for a second. Tell me, why are you telling me this? So many of us forget to set context for people, particularly for people. I don't know if any of the listeners are the kinds of people that do a lot of internal dialogue. There's sometimes, people do a lot of internal processing, meaning that they run things through in their head. And so sometimes if we run things through in our head before we actually go to communicate with other people, we can think that we've actually set context, but we're already halfway through the journey. So really important for us to know our intention or our big picture. Now, what does that actually mean? What it means is we want to be asking ourselves before we communicate or before we're making a decision, we want to be asking, what's the intention of my communication here? What is it that I actually actually am trying to communicate, what is the outcome that I'm trying to achieve. And by doing that, we actually start to create for ourselves a bit of a framework, or we start to build a container for the audience. So let's say, for example, that you have a team of people and you want them to do some kind of you want them to utilize a time management system, or you want them to track their progress in what they're doing, or perhaps maybe they're not keeping their notes or their doco on the processes that they're doing, etc. So what we really want to do is we want to, rather than just telling them that they must do X, Y, and Z and giving them an instruction, we want to set a context for why that's important. And most importantly, one of the things that people do in their communication, so next to intention and big picture, you want to put context, you want to put why am I about to communicate as your notes. And then in addition to that, what you want to do is you want to think about what is the value of why for the person you're asking this from. So for example, if I was going to be having a conversation with a team member about data entry on their time entries, or some kind of project management system that allows me to track things, I know that a lot of people make assumptions that that leads to micromanagement, or that we're thinking that they're not doing their jobs correctly or something like that. So we want to stamp out all of those objections by setting the context around what's in it for them. Why are we asking them to do this that will actually benefit them? So we want to start to be thinking about what's their motivation to take action. Now, in a client engagement, it might be, I'm giving you this overview because as we go through this project, we need to be really clear on what it is that you need from us, so that we're not putting in variations, or we're not looking at, trying to change the project plan midway, which could be costly to you. So we really want to make sure that we stay on track and that the project doesn't become costly for you. So that's an example of setting context. It's an example of the big picture and that frame for outcomes. So here's takeaway number 2, guys. Takeaway number 2 is context. If the context is clear, then, oops, I'm having a little tech issue here. Let me do that. If the context is clear, then to the communicator, it's sometimes rarely passed on in the communication. So remember that the context may be clear to you, but as the communicator, but we rarely pass that on in the communication. So make sure you always set context. And even if you're not a big picture or not a vision person, one of the things that you need to know about learning styles is, and we may present this at a later date, we have a technique called the format system. This is learning styles, and so they actually go in a particular order. A why person, which is the first learning style, cannot listen unless someone has given them a vision or a why they need to be motivated to listen. So you could start with my framing for outcomes method and muddle up the order, and it wouldn't work as efficiently. So we always start with the big picture first and the why first, okay? So let's look at the second quadrant of the framing for outcomes process. And the second quadrant here is around what specifically, or what specific instructions do we actually want to undertake. So this is where people who love details, this is where you can go for your life. But most importantly, what's really important about this is if you want somebody to actually follow an order and sequence, it's important for you to know what the next steps are and what the details are, and to frame this in the specific instruction. A lot of the time, people will give an instruction and they do the process quite unconsciously. Like, who's ever been on autopilot? This is a little example for you guys to conceptualize this for me, right? Who's ever been in the car and you've taken the road, you're driving home from work, or you're driving home from wherever you've been, and you're driving along and you arrive in your driveway or in the garage, and you realize, oh my God, I can't remember the last 10 minutes of this journey. I have no idea what I was thinking. And so this is what we call autopilot, or actually the technical term for it is called unconscious competence. That is when we operate on autopilot and we kind of just do things intuitively because we've done them so many times. Now, if you're a leader and you're leading teams to do things all the time, what you probably recognize is that your way of doing things is quite on autopilot, but we may not be making making allowances for people who perhaps are only doing it for the second or the third time, or they do it intermittently. So what we want to do here is we want to showcase what specifically do we want them to do. So in the example that I shared earlier with the Ken and Tony example, probably a better way for them to frame that up would have been to actually say, look, what I specifically need you to do, like here's the vision for the project that I need to do. What I need you to do is to collate this document, this document, this document for the scope of works, and it needs to be ready and put together by no later than this date. And, you know, please let me know if you can actually do that. Otherwise, I might need to make some alternative arrangements. So it would have been much more specific in the instruction of the documents that I needed to gather for them, how I needed to put them together, what other parties we needed to bring in into the process, because there were other, you know, there was a technical salesperson and there was a salesperson, so we actually needed some other people to come in, and the project lead was across what was going on as well along with me. So I think it's really important that you're clear on your instructions. So if you need some guidelines on how to do this for yourself when you're preparing this, the question you ask yourself is that if I was going to do this myself and I was doing it step by step as if I was learning it for the first time, what would be the 3 or 4 action items that I would follow in order for me to know that I would totally nail it? Or what would be the content pieces that I would absolutely need to know that if I didn't have them, this could potentially fail as a request? So I think it's really important just to jot down a couple of dot points and a couple of notes on that so that you can speak to that. Now, as I said to you, this can be utilized in many different contexts. You can jot down a couple of notes to prompt you on a phone conversation or in a meeting. It could be used in a formal email where you actually outline something along with a proposal document or a scope of works or something along those lines. So this is our content. So if you like, this is the coffee that we're putting inside the cup, right? So I'm keeping an eye on the chat. Great to have those questions coming through. Please keep them coming through, guys. Great to have you, you know, participating fully, and I'm looking forward to actually addressing some of those. So as we look at the next part of the process, step 3 is to be clear on our next steps and our deadline. So this is about order and sequence. I don't know how many of you might cook, or you have friends and family that cook, but there are certain recipes and things that you put together that you can't put them together in a reverse order. Just like this framing for outcomes method. If you did it from the bottom up, it wouldn't work anywhere near as well. In fact, it'd probably create confrontation in your conversation, and you'll see why in a minute. So the thing is that there needs, sometimes with projects that we're doing, there needs to be next steps and deadlines. There needs to be things that we understand that we are one cog that fits into a big project. And I think that for many of you that might be listening or watching this recording, many of you may know that in your project there are certain things that have to happen, and if they don't happen, then it delays other things in the project, right? So it's really important that we have clarity. And if we come back, actually, if I put the slides backwards a second here, and we come back to this intention and the big picture, if you do have a project request that it not being done by a certain time is actually going to delay other parts of the project, it's really important to put that context in that overview. So as you start to work through, you see that some of these elements can influence others, and it prompts you to think about, oh wow, damn, I forgot out of their big intention or the vision that this is actually a really integral part of the project, so I better pop that in. So I'll come back to next steps and deadline. Some of us are good at being able to give an order and a sequence, because if we're process driven, then we know, you know, step 1 is this, step 2 is that, you know, this is how it works in the process. However, a lot of the time we're not specifying a deadline. You know, urgent is not a deadline. ASAP is definitely not a deadline. By 4 o'clock is a deadline. You know, by Tuesday at 4 o'clock next week, that is a deadline. So it's really important to understand that if we actually pop a deadline in there, then people have something to work to, and they actually know clearly what it is that we want them to understand. That's a great question. I cannot wait to answer that one. Thank you so much. So the next framework is the final piece in the puzzle, which is the follow-up. So this almost is is non-existent in most contexts. In fact, it doesn't matter which industry I'm working in. It doesn't matter whether it's sales professionals, technical people, engineers, vets and doctors or dentists. It's almost never present. And this is our follow-up. And what's really important is that it says there in brackets, deliver a consequence or a reward. So in the framing for your outcomes, I think that it's really important to reference the fact that if something happens that it's not able to happen, this is the consequence of that. If something does happen, then this is the reward or this is the benefit that we'll see altogether. Now, it's really interesting because I would like to use a couple of examples of where we've utilized this just to kind of help solidify that a little bit more. There was a general manager of a big logistics company that we've worked with extensively who had a challenge where his team turnover, so he had people in operations, he had people in sales, he had a whole team, finance and accounts. And what was really interesting was the entire business was turning over its staff really, really quickly. When he came into the role, and when he within 6 months of being there, I think they turned over the team twice, right? So they were hiring, that's a big impact. I saw your reaction there, Peter. I'm sure a lot of people listening in are going, man, that's really bad, right? So they turned over the team a number of times, and they brought me in to do a leadership program and to figure out what was going wrong in his communication and his leadership. And what was really interesting was that one of the first principles that I shared with this gentleman was the framing for outcomes method. And what we learned from a day or two of observation in the office was that there was no clarity on what actually needed to be done. And then, of course, there'd be spot fires to put out. And usually the instruction was one that was extremely heated with a lot of emotion as well, and not much clarity and guidelines on what to fix or why it even mattered that we needed to fix it. So people were getting rubbed up the wrong way, for lack of a better term, and thinking, well, this is all too hard, it's too stressful, I don't want to be here. So within a couple of weeks of working with this gentleman and teaching the framing for outcomes method, not only did there start to be a lot more synergy, deadlines being met, people being clear about what they needed to do, having guidelines, having leadership, really, at the end of the day, it actually made a huge impact. And it's 7 years since I delivered that program. And the gentleman still has exactly the same team. So it's pretty incredible. So and they are actually I think the top performing business in the country. So it's a state business and the top performing business in the country. So this can go a long way in team synergy as well. So we've got some great frameworks here. Now, of course, there's always place for conversation, right? But if we're not clear in the intention, then it leaves people to make their own assumptions about what you need when you need it. Now, this is not to say that we can't have a dialogue. You might send this to somebody, and then as a part of the end of the program, at the end of the documentation for the frames, you might turn around and say to them, look, if you think there's a better way, if you think there's an opportunity for us to tighten this up, I'd love to hear your thoughts or your ideas, or please contribute, a couple of solutions that you have in mind. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we give no guidelines, then we really don't know what assumptions people are going to make at the other end. And I think that that's really important. But coming back to the follow-up, the delivery, and the outcome, this is about consequences and rewards. Now, I know that sounds really, really harsh, particularly in a business environment, right? But many of you are familiar with this idea of people are motivated either by the carrot or they're motivated by the stick, yeah? So that's what we call classically in NLP, away from or toward motivation. So I'm either motivated from moving away from a consequence or a potential punishment or something that, I might get a warning, I might lose a client, I might, have an altercation with a client. So I may be motivated to act based on the fact that I want to move away from a potential consequence or an altercation. There are some people, though, that are actually motivated by possibility. So this is where they're motivated by the carrot, and they're looking for the possibility of what actually can happen, and how much easier or more effortless this could be, or how much more streamlined or effective this could be. So we want to be able to highlight to people the impact, if you like, if you don't like the word consequence, because some people think of punishment, and I don't want to trigger anybody into remembering their childhood or their school days. But if we think about the impact or a negative impact that could happen if the person is unable to meet the criteria or the deadline, as well as a positive impact that can happen. Now, again, this is one of those areas where people will often be in a position where they actually will think about the impact for themselves as opposed to thinking about the impact for the client. So for example, let's say that you've just put together a scope of works for a client and they need to do their prereqs checklist or their kickoff meeting, and they need to, bring together a bunch of people, and there might be, 6 or 7 people that you need to bring to this meeting, and you're having trouble getting 2 of them. Client wants to proceed, but you don't want to because that's going to lead to a bunch of variations down the track when we're, mid-program and this person finally pops up their head and says, hey, but I want this. And it's like, well, you weren't at the prereqs meeting, or you weren't at the kickoff meeting. So, these things can sometimes get in the way. That might be an example where you'd use framing for outcomes, and you'd say, look, the intention of the kickoff session is for us to achieve all of these goals. What we need to do next is we need to sign off on this, this, and this, which, needs this person from that department, this person from that department, this person from that department. I appreciate that, you'd like to get this moving, and so not being able to get those 2 people may seem like it's not a big deal to you. In the overall scope of the project, it actually is, because here's the consequences of not having that. And we would want to make sure, now here's the benefit for them, right? We would want to make sure that we can deliver everything that you need that's on scope and on budget, and the consequence of not having them there could lead to costly variations for you down the track, and we really don't want that to happen. So we want to make sure that it's on cost, on budget, on scope, and not have variations. So we're highlighting what's in it for them, again, in the consequences and the rewards, rather than what's in it for us or what's in it for me as you write the email or as you discuss this situation. So the final thought on that is that I'd like to give you takeaway number 3. I'll pop that back on the screen there for you with my slides. And takeaway number 3 is that assumption is the mother of all misunderstanding. So if you take nothing else away from what we've chatted about it today with framing for outcomes, please stop assuming that people know exactly what you're talking about. Just because it's in your head doesn't mean you've actually communicated it. And so when we're using the framing for outcomes method and we're getting feedback from our audience, from the people that we're communicating with, it is designed to create dialogue as opposed to being prescriptive or for being like an order. However, it allows clarity if an order is if you actually need to give somebody an instruction, it does allow for that clarity. But there is room to tweak each of these segments to invite feedback, to invite a opportunity for the person to actually say that they understood. Now, this is not part of the framing for outcomes, but I often teach it when I teach framing for outcomes. I don't know how many of you have read the checklist manifesto, or you've looked into checklists and procedures, the difference between the both. One of the things that we know from aviation is that there's a lot of checklists, there's a lot of checkpoints that actually come in that process. And so if you know someone who's in aviation, a pilot, or if you know someone, or maybe you are a pilot yourself, one of the things that
I am, as at 2 weeks ago.
Excellent. Congratulations. That is awesome. You got your license 2 weeks ago, did you, Peter?
Yeah.
Oh,
well, the government's still processing it, but I passed the flight test.
Oh, that calls for a celebration. So everybody send a hey yeah in the chat or something like that for Peter. Well done. And so what you know is when you call through to a control tower, right, there's often a thing that they do in aviation called a readback, right? And the readback, actually, maybe Peter can tell us, what's the purpose of a readback, Peter?
Make sure you got the information right. So anything critical has to be read back. For example, out of Bankstown where I fly, when you're given clearance to take off, you have to specifically say which runway. So they'll say clearance for clear for takeoff, runway 29 right. You have to repeat clear for takeoff, runway 29 right. Because, obvious reasons.
Yeah, and that is because, as intelligent as we all are, there's a flaw in human behavior that we miss detail sometimes, or that, we think we understood something, but because we're processing 11 million bits of information per second, the 126 bits that the pilot actually picked up on might be different from what the radio control tower person actually said. And so, it's really important that we do this readback. Now, I think that what's super important is that we don't look at this as being a prescriptive process, and we don't look at it as being tyrants in our workforce. We want to encourage dialogue. And so when we talk about the checklists and the readback, please don't think that I'm asking you to go to your teams or go to your clients and then ask them to tell you, hey, so you tell me what you're going to do. Can you read back what I just said to you? It's a metaphor, guys, right? So I think what's important is getting that checkpoint. And if people look like they might be struggling to understand what you've asked of them, then you invite the feedback. You invite them to ask questions. And most importantly, you might even want to encourage them to say, or you could ask the question like this. You could say, let me know what's your plan of attack. So, given the nature of how important this is, given our deadlines, given the consequences or the impact of not getting it done, what's your plan of attack? Do you need any support? And getting them to actually walk you through in a dialogue, what they plan to do based on what they've understood. So I think we're just about at our time for some Q&A. I can see that there's a few there. The one final thing that I'd like to do is I've got another gift for you. As you know, we all have different styles of communication, which I've alluded to throughout this presentation. So I've got a gift for everybody on the call. If you're curious about how your communication might be killing your results, this is the keys to effective communication. It's a little test. It'll reveal to you what is your preference in communication. And then there's a short little video training which gives you an introduction to your communication style, how it may differ from other people. So we'll make sure that we get that link out to you. It may be interactive. You might be able to click on it from the webinar. Otherwise, we can pop that either in the chat or we can send it out to you post-session.
Yeah, I'll send it out with the recording.
Wonderful. That would be super. So, overall, guys, action items that I'd like to challenge you, encourage you to do is to, write an email to somebody using the frames methodology, before the end of the day, solidify that knowledge. We need a coffee cup, we need some coffee inside. We've got to give, some instructions on, how to pick it up and, from which angle do you want them to pick it up and which side do you want them to sip it from? Do they need to blow on it first? Is it really hot? And then what are the consequences if they don't do that? So if they drink it too soon, they might burn their mouth. If they, drink it at the right time, then they'll have an enjoyable experience with the cup of coffee. So, crude example again, but that's our method. That's our framing for outcomes method. So I'd really like to encourage you to, print out the framing for outcomes map and put it on your desk. I'll make sure that Peter has that so that he can send it off to you guys. And we have teams of people that have these printed out and put on their desk so that they can actually prompt themselves to remember, did I set context? Because for all of you, you'll have a weakness in one of the areas. You might be really good at setting the vision, or you might be really good at the detail part. You might be really good at communicating deadlines and outcomes, or you might be really good at being able to motivate people, carrot stick, toward away from, consequences, rewards, etc. So, for those of you that may think that this is common sense, you'd be surprised how many of you might miss one area consistently. So put it up there so that you can prompt the communication in this format and practice the method in all the conversations that you're having, because it is very effective in the outcome. And so, a couple of different examples in different contexts to share with you before we go to Q&A. We had a sales manager who utilized this framework with the team, had a bunch of team members that were, showing up late, didn't necessarily have their paperwork and everything that they needed in place all of the time. And so they set up framing for outcomes to set a new game that they were actually going to run. And they used it as a competition so that way whoever got their habits installed and they met the criteria within the period of a month were contributing to an overall reward with the team. And if one person in the team actually dropped any of the criteria, it meant that everybody missed out on the actual reward for the team. So it worked really effectively to frame the rules of the game for the conversation. Why are we doing this? What's the impact to the team, to the business? Here's what we need to do. Here's the rules. Here's how long it runs for. Here's what happens if you don't actually do it. So that was really, really good use of it. I already mentioned about the husband and wife that saved their marriage as a result of using framing for outcomes in their communication with each other. And I sort of alluded to an organization that we work with, an IT organization, and they utilize this in the communication with clients to reduce the impact of not bringing people to the meetings, that, you know, the kickoff meetings and the pre-rec meetings, which was leading to a lot of costly variations that of course their clients wanted to argue with them about later. And so what this also helps to do is it helps to put ownership back on the person who's receiving the communication, to ensure that there's a dialogue with that. So really looking forward to getting into some of these questions, Peter. Have you got any to start off with?
I do have a couple, actually. So my first one was, obviously you've talked about using the tool as a framework yourself for sharing the information with others. But when you talked about the readback thing, I thought, do you ever use it the other way? So you get information from someone and you're not 100% sure whether you've got it correctly. You put what you think you've got into the tool and send it back to them as a check, as a readback.
100%. It works really well. And if you're in a dialogue, like that works if you've got an email correspondence or something that's written down that's static. However, if you're in a dialogue with someone, this is where the power of questions comes up, right? So to be able to ask people the questions, I joked and I mentioned about how I've had many an altercation with my father where he'll give me a long-winded, detailed instruction, and, you know, I'll say, hang on a second, Dad, hang on. You know, why are you telling me all of this? What do you want me to know? Or where are we going with this? So that actually helps me to then bring him back to giving me the big picture. So you can actually utilize the same methodology if there's a part of the process. So, okay, so you're giving me instruction, Mr. Client. So what specifically would you like me to start with? It's my assumption from what you've said, or it's my understanding from what you've said that you want me to proceed in X, Y, Z order. Is that correct? Or is there a different way? So 100%, it works for dialogues, not just for monologues.
Yeah, nice.
Beautiful.
All right. I have one more, but I might go to the everyone else's questions.
Let everybody get a go first. Okay, we can come back to yours again. Now, did you want to read them out, or did you want me to? Or
yeah, I can read them out. The first one is, can you share the recording later? And we definitely will. So that's easy. Then I'm going to jump to the last one, which is from Steve saying, can you please put up the slide with all the steps again?
Oh, yes.
I will send this out, but if it goes up now, people can take a screenshot and take it down.
100%. Yep. Let me pop that up on the screen there for you. I will just put it back for the big picture. There we go. So there is the big picture on the screen for you. Winning.
All right. Cool.
Excellent.
All right. Another question here from Anonymous. This is very prescriptive. Do you ever have people complaining that they have no freedom of choice, i.e. they get told what to do and when to do it and in which order?
That's an awesome question. I saw that one pop up, and I want to thank the person who answered that, who asked that one, because it shows me that there's a great level of critical thinking in, you know, the way in which you're looking at this, because, you know, to be able to conceptualize that and to imagine it actually playing out in a team, it shows me that you're already thinking about utilizing this tool, which is fantastic. So I think that it depends on the languaging that you put in each steps. Like, what we want to do is we want to use influential language as opposed to being authoritarian in our language. I think there wants to be a certain amount of the answer. Let me give the answer this way. So yes, it could be if misused, because it could seem like a dictation to somebody. However, what we do know is that if we don't have any framework, then generally we don't get our outcomes, because people have so many different styles of communication that they then leave it up to the assumption. And don't get me wrong, I don't think that there's anybody out there who's intentionally wanting to do a poor job. Like, this is not a judgment on people in your team or clients or colleagues or anything like that. It's more that because people's methods are so different, if we don't give a framework for people to work within, then we leave it open to interpretation, and the interpretation may not get us the outcome. So I think that it has the potential to be prescriptive in answer to that question. Often if you've got a project or you've got deadlines or you've got something that needs to be delivered, there's only a certain amount of freedom and choice anyway. Like, we have to deliver on our outcomes. So we have to give people some guidelines, and that's really set by what the content is that you put in each of these segments. So you can make it non-confrontational and non-dictatorship or non-authoritarian by the nature of the language that you use. Like, for example, our team and our clients who have sales teams, they actually utilize framing for outcomes for emails that they follow up sales conversations. So it's kind of like, it was great to chat to you about X, Y, and Z. Here's the next steps. If we kick off on this by this date, then we'll be able to take advantage of this wonderful thing that we chatted about. Consequence of not doing it before close of business Friday is that you'll miss out on all that extra value that we were chatting about. And here we go, we can do it this way. However, if there's an opportunity to do something a little bit different, or if you've got some guidelines, then please communicate it back to me. So I was talking about that in terms of the opportunity for questions and the opportunity for feedback. So yeah. Hopefully that's answered the question for you.
Pretty thorough.
Thank you.
All right. So another one here. So you mentioned that we need to apply consequence/rewards when criteria are or aren't met. What if people do the right thing, but the outcome's still not achieved? In brackets, perhaps because of others have not played ball.
Yeah, that's a really, really, really good question. So I'm going to use a little bit of an example that's outside the context of this, if it's okay to answer as part of the answer to this question. So one of the things that I do is what we call personal breakthrough work with professionals. So this is where people have what I call the itty bitty shitty committee. It's the group of people that sit on their shoulder and tell them why they can't do what they want to do. And so you mentioned in my introduction that I'm also an instructor of hypnotherapy. We do timeline therapy, NLP, and these are all about the language of the mind and how it affects our results. So in that context, when I'm doing this breakthrough work with these individuals, there's some assignments and some things that they need to do between the sessions in order to get a result. And so one of the things, there's an element of criteria in this. So the first thing is that I've made sure that I've designed the tasks that get them a result. So the question is, have you thought through the plan in order to make sure that if everybody does play ball, that they do get the result? Because sometimes people don't get the result, but it's because we haven't done the pre-thinking, or what Ray Dalio would call a pre-mortem, where you actually look at, what would, rather than a post-mortem, because we often assess projects and their efficiency post-project as opposed to pre-project. So, have you done a pre-mortem, as Ray Dalio would call it in his book Principles? And do you know what needs to happen in order for the outcome to be met? And have you considered all the parties that need to play? Also, what are the rules of the game for all the parties that need to play? So in my case, with this breakthrough, this professional breakthrough that we do, I design the tasking and the assignments that the clients do between sessions, knowing that if they do them, then they will get the result. And we actually do it. I actually offer a money back guarantee on what I do with that. So I have to be sturdy and know that if I give these tasks, that the outcome will be achieved, right? Mm-hmm. And the second thing is that I need to communicate the frames to the client and anyone else who might be involved in that. So sometimes a company will enlist me to do a breakthrough with one of their team members, in which case then the party that's going to be supporting them in the workplace needs to be across what the tasking is, so that they're clear how to support them and that they can get that outcome. So have I communicated to all parties involved, as well as have I set the criteria correctly for them to know what can happen and what doesn't? Now, it might be that it's very difficult to enforce a consequence or a reward when someone hasn't been communicated that. So, often we will enforce a consequence. Take variations in a scope of works project, right? So often people will get bills. In fact, I've got a client at the moment in WA, did a project with a software company building some software for them, and they've just received a bill for $58,000 worth of variations for last month, and there was no communication about that. And we're chatting about that at the moment in terms of what was specified, what wasn't, what was in the contract, the prereqs, the kickoff, all of that sort of thing. So, often if you go back to your client and you just stack them with a bunch of fees and they didn't know the rules of the game, then it's really hard for you to be able to clarify that, right? So it's really about the communication of it. And so if there's other parties that didn't play ball, if that's the example, then did we do the pre-work that we needed to make sure that we communicated what they needed to do, and what was the consequence of that if they didn't? So sometimes you can give people all of the rules of the game and all of the frameworks, and then they still don't play ball. And that's the nature of human behavior. And one of the reasons that I believe that, communicating consequences and rewards for what's in it for the party is so important. Because if we don't, then, human behavior comes up. We get below the line again with the blame, excuses and denial. I know many of you may have heard that above and below the line principle. Sometimes we can get below the line, or our clients or other parties can get below the line if we haven't set the framework correctly from the very beginning. So I hope that helps to answer that question.
I think so, yeah. I've actually, one of my questions was a little related to that, so I'll jump into that now. Do you ever build in a consequence or reward that isn't otherwise there? So in some cases, I'm thinking in particular, the potential payoff can be a bit risky. You're not sure whether you're going to get there, or it might be far off in the future and you want something more tangible. Do you ever build your own consequences or rewards into this?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you mean in context with yourself, or with the project with someone else?
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking with a team. So you might say, oh, well, look, let's say a marketing team. Sometimes the benefits of the actions they do now are a long way away. So do you ever build something in that's a bit more tangible now?
Yeah, 100%. And, this would be very relevant for a lot of people who, work on long-term projects. I imagine we've got a few of those people listening in here. If you've got a project that's going to roll out over 2 years or 3 years sometimes, then, having a reward that's 3 years down the track is a bit hard for people to keep their eye on while they're going through the day-to-day. So this is where milestones are really important. So I would absolutely look at things that you can build into the process that allow, like, for example, I mentioned the sales manager as one of the examples before, how he set this up with the team, right? And he had a very important intention for himself, which was to make sure that his team were efficient, they were on time, that they were getting their paperwork in, that their CRM was being updated regularly, etc. So that was his outcome. But the outcome for the team was about fun. It was about cohesion. It was about getting better results, being in a better state of mind, pumping them up, having something other than just aiming for their annual budget, because if a salesperson's doing the same thing day in, day out for 12 months, and their only guideline or their only reward or consequence is the target, that the number that they achieve at the end of the year, or that they miss at the end of the year, then it's hard to stay on track. So what he did was he built out little milestone rewards, each quarter, or, whatever it may be, where they'd have these little competitions with consequences and rewards. So I hope that helps. Peter, does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's good.
Awesome.
All right, we've got two more, which we should be able to rattle through. One is regarding how this relates to a specific tool from Theory of Constraints. Now, obviously, that's, well, maybe not obviously, that's what our sort of background.
Yeah.
So I'll quickly answer that.
That'd be great. As you know, I have some knowledge of it, but I imagine that it's nowhere near your level of knowledge. So I'd love to hand that one over to you, Peter.
All right, good. I would say, in relation to the strategy and tactic tree, it's somewhat similar to the strategy and tactic part, in that you have a effect you're going for, and then obviously tactics to achieve it. What I would say the strategy and tactic tree from Theory of Constraints is missing, that this has, is adding in the relevance of due dates to individual things, and the relevance of the consequence and reward, which is missing, I suppose, entirely from the strategy and tactic tree. So a little bit, the structure's there, but I would say this is far more useful in actual application to teams and people to do something with, as opposed to a strategic document, I suppose, that plans things out.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can add something, it's kind of like that whole strategy. Sometimes when you use the strategy tree, you can end up in loops if there's multiple decisions available. What, as you rightly said, having the deadlines and the outcomes actually gives you almost like an endpoint that allows you to close something off. So that's
Mm.
another added benefit, I suppose. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Nice. All right, and last one here. Does the framing method work in all circumstances, and specifically with individuals that are smart but not necessarily team players?
Awesome question. Thank you so much. So does it work with everybody? So yes, and let me preface that with a little caveat, if I can, please. Humans, if we've got any Matrix fans, I'm a diehard Matrix fan. I just love it, right? So if you remember that scene with the architect where he goes through how they've been through the Matrix several times and it never works, it always collapses on itself. The reason that it collapses on itself is choice, right? And so as human beings, we have choices and we have what we call in hypnosis free will, right? So no one can control your behavior unless you're allowing them to persuade you to follow their instructions. So this is one of the wonderful things, and also one of the limitations, is that we can't make anybody do anything that they don't want to do. And I'll use this example. So my book, Confident Closing, originally I actually wanted to call it Feeding Salt to Horses. And we've all heard the saying that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? So the premise of the book is about, if we feed the horses salt, by the time we show them the water, they're going to be thirsty and they're going to drink because they want to. So this method allows you to create a platform where you find the salt for your team members, as in, like, most of the time when people don't play, like if they're really intelligent and they're really great operators, and you love having them because they're an asset to the outcomes, but they cause a whole lot of problems for your team members because they just don't play well with others, then one, as a leader, you have a choice around, is it worthwhile allowing them, because remember, people have different learning styles, is it worthwhile allowing them to operate autonomously and communicate with one person around their progress? That's an option. The other way of doing it is to actually find out what is their why, and why would they want to be involved in the team, and then use framing to be able to set a platform like the sales manager that I was telling you did, to get everybody invested in doing all of their little KPIs and their action items. He created fun around it. So if you can find out what is the why for that one person that perhaps is not the team player, and then create either a game or a little mini project or an incentive of some sort utilizing framing for outcomes, then you might have a better option to do that. So use the framing for outcomes tool as the salt that you feed to the horses, and then rather than forcing them to try and do something, you're creating a need for them, a desire for them to actually play and participate. So I hope that answers the question for that wonderful person who put that in the chat there.
Nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that's us. So thank you very much for coming along and talking to us today. I know I've got a lot out of it. And as I've mentioned I don't think I mentioned today on the call, but in the sort of build up, I'll be having a go with this tool, and I'll write it up so that anybody who participates can at least see my sort of desperate first attempt at using it.
Well, that's awesome. I really like to encourage everybody to use it. It really is such a simple tool. And I think that you'll find, even if you only did it to like 50% because you just learned it, you'd still get a better outcome than perhaps maybe how you've been doing it to date. And it's not to say that you haven't been doing it well. What I know from the experience and working with thousands of people with this tool is that everybody always misses one area, or they're light on one area. So even if you only use it to 50%, you'll probably highlight that area you've been missing and get a better outcome anyway. So yeah.
Nice. All right. Thank you. And all the recording and the slides and everything will be coming out in the next day or so. So you'll all get that. And of course, anybody that's registered will get that as well. So thank you once again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, everybody. Have a wonderful day and go out there and frame those outcomes. Thanks again. Bye for now.